Welcome to our deep dives into the incredible world of the brain
Yeah.
and how it shapes our social connections, our altruistic tendencies, and experiences of compassion.
Yeah.
We're going to be exploring
Right.
some groundbreaking research that might just turn your understanding of these concepts upside down.
Well, what's particularly interesting is that we often think about compassion as a purely emotional experience.
Right.
But what we're going to uncover is that it's deeply rooted in the very structure and
Yeah.
function of our brains.
It's like we have these biological pathways for kindness built right into our neural wiring.
Right.
It's a pretty amazing thought.
Absolutely.
And we're going to start our journey by exploring something we all experience.
Okay.
Touch.
Okay.
Now, you might be thinking, what does touch have to do with compassion?
Right.
But it turns out there's a powerful connection there.
Think about it. A hug from a loved one,
Yeah.
a gentle caress, even a friendly pat on the back. These simple acts of touch can evoke powerful feelings of warmth.
Comfort and connection.
And it's not just a subjective feeling.
Right.
There's a specific type of nerve fiber
Mm-hmm.
called the C-tactile afferent
Yeah.
that's dedicated to processing this kind of gentle,
right.
pleasant touch.
Yeah.
It's like a direct line to the emotional heart of the brain.
And the fascinating thing is that people with fewer of these C-tactile afferents actually report feeling less pleasant touch.
Yeah.
And show lower levels of empathy.
Really?
So our physical experience of touch is literally shaping our capacity for social connection and compassion.
That makes you realize how important physical contact is.
Yeah.
Especially in those early years when our brains are developing.
Absolutely.
Speaking of early development,
Mm-hmm.
let's talk about the amazing transformations that happen in the brain when someone becomes a parent.
You might have heard about the mommy brain,
All right?
but what about the daddy brain?
Uh-huh.
It turns out that fathers undergo significant neural changes as well.
Particularly in a region of the brain called the ventral tegmental area,
Okay.
or VTA.
Now, I remember from my psychology classes that the VTA is a key part of the brain's reward system. Isn't that the system that's activated by things like food and sex?
That's right.
Okay.
And when fathers see pictures of their own children,
Yeah.
their VTAs light up in a very similar way to what we see in mothers.
Wow.
This suggests that paternal caregiving is just as deeply ingrained in our biology as maternal caregiving.
So it's not just a societal expectation that dads bond with their kids. Their brains are wired for it.
Exactly.
Which makes a strong case for encouraging fathers to be actively involved in caregiving, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's even more fascinating research showing that fathers who spend more time actively caring for their children show even stronger VTA responses to their kids' pictures.
Wow.
It's like a positive feedback loop. The more you nurture, the more rewarding it becomes at a neural level.
This feeling of reward isn't limited to family, though. Even interacting with strangers can activate this system.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the fascinating concept of social resonance.
Okay.
Our brains literally sync up with others during interactions.
Mhm.
Have you ever noticed yourself unconsciously mirroring someone's facial expressions or body language?
We all do it.
Right.
When we observe someone's actions, our own motor cortex, the part of the brain responsible for movement,
Yeah.
shows activity that mirrors what we're seeing.
Wow.
It's as if our brains are trying to do the action ourselves, even though our bodies remain still.
So basically, my brain is doing synchronized swimming with anyone I talk to.
Yeah.
That explains a lot about my awkwardness.
Uh-huh.
But this resonance, it's not just about mimicking movements, right?
Right.
It's about tapping into the other person's emotional state and creating a shared experience.
Exactly.
Okay.
This resonance helps us understand other people's emotions and intentions,
Right.
creating a sense of connection and forming the basis for empathy. And this isn't just limited to symbol actions.
Okay.
Research has shown that seeing someone in pain can activate similar brain areas in us as if we were feeling the pain ourselves.
That makes sense. We've all felt that twinge of empathy when we see someone get hurt.
Right.
But let's dive deeper into the brain,
Okay.
specifically a region that often gets a bad rap,
Uh-huh.
the amygdala.
The amygdala is often portrayed as the brain's fear center, but that's a very simplistic view.
Okay.
It's actually involved in processing any information with strong emotional intensity,
Okay.
whether it's positive or negative.
Wait, so you're telling me that the same brain region that gets fired up during a scary movie also lights up when we experience something beautiful or heartwarming?
Yeah.
That's a real mind bender.
Think about those moments that take your breath away, whether it's a stunning piece of art,
Right.
a heartwarming act of kindness, or the feeling of love. Those are all intensely emotional experiences,
Right.
and your amygdala is likely buzzing with activity.
So it's not about the specific emotion, but the intensity, the feeling that gets the amygdala going.
Exactly.
But how does this relate to pro-social behaviors, like altruism?
Mm-hmm.
We tend to think of compassion as a positive emotion,
Right.
but the amygdala is traditionally associated with fear and anxiety.
Yeah,
Seems like a bit of a paradox.
that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
There's growing evidence of a link between amygdala activity and pro-social behaviors like altruism and empathy.
Really?
For example, one fascinating study looked at people who donate a kidney to complete strangers.
Oh, wow.
Talk about going above and beyond.
So,
Researchers found that these altruistic donors have a unique amygdala signature.
okay, now I'm really curious.
Yeah.
What makes these donors so special? Is there something different about their amygdala?
Their amygdalae show heightened activity when they see fearful facial expressions,
Interesting.
suggesting an increased sensitivity to others' distress.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, they are also better at accurately recognizing fear in others' faces.
So there's a connection between the ability to perceive and respond to fear
Yeah.
and the motivation to help those in need.
Exactly.
But does this mean some people are simply wired for extraordinary kindness?
That's a question that researchers are still exploring, but what's clear is that the amygdala,
Mm-hmm.
far from being just a fear center,
Right.
plays a complex role in our capacity for empathy,
Okay.
compassion, and pro-social motivation.
Wow.
And it's this interplay of brain chemistry and social emotions that makes us uniquely human.
This is all so fascinating. We've learned about a special nerve fiber for pleasant touch,
Right.
the rewiring of the paternal brain,
Mm-hmm.
the phenomenon social resonance, and the amygdala's surprising role in compassion.
Absolutely.
When we're just getting started.
Yeah.
But before we jump into the next part of our deep dive,
Okay.
I want to leave you with this question to ponder.
Okay.
Does knowing there might be a biological basis for kindness make these acts any less remarkable?
We'll be back after a short break to explore more about the neuroscience of compassion
Okay.
and what it reveals about our capacity for good.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Welcome back to our exploration of the compassionate brain. Now, you might be wondering if our brains are wired for connection and empathy. Why do we see so much conflict and suffering in the world?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
If we have this biological capacity for kindness, why isn't the world a more compassionate place?
Well, it's important to remember that our brains are incredibly complex systems, constantly responding to both internal and external cues. While we might have these innate tendencies towards compassion, they can be overridden by other powerful drives like fear, self-preservation, and even social pressure.
So it's like a constant tug of war between our better angels and those more primal instincts. But does that mean we're destined to be caught in this cycle of conflict and division?
Not necessarily. There's a growing body of research suggesting that we can actually train our brains for compassion, strengthening those neural pathways that support empathy and prosocial behavior.
That's encouraging. But how do we do that? Is it like building a muscle? The more we use it, the stronger it gets.
It's a great analogy. And one of the most effective ways to work out our compassion muscles is through mindfulness meditation. You see, when we practice mindfulness, we're essentially training our attention to be more present and non-judgmental.
So instead of getting caught up in those reactive thought patterns that can lead to stress and negativity, we're learning to observe our thoughts and emotions with more clarity and acceptance.
Precisely. And the shift in perspective can have a profound impact on our brains and our behavior. Studies have shown that mindfulness meditation can actually increase activity in the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in regulating our emotions and impulses, while decreasing activity in the amygdala, which, as we've discussed, plays a role in our fear and stress responses.
So by calming down that fight or flight response, we're creating more space for empathy and compassion to emerge.
Exactly. And here's the really exciting part. These changes aren't just temporary starts. They can actually lead to lasting structural changes in the brain. Studies have shown that long-term meditators have increased gray matter volume in areas like the hippocampus, which is crucial for learning and memory, and the insula, which is involved in processing emotions and bodily sensations.
So it's like mindfulness meditation is giving our brains a compassion workout, building up those empathy muscles over time. But does this translate into real-world changes in behavior? Do people who meditate regularly actually act more kindly and altruistically?
That's the million-dollar question, and while more research is always needed, there's promising evidence that the answer is yes. Studies have shown that people who practice mindfulness meditation are more likely to engage in pro-social behaviors, such as helping someone in need or donating to charity. They also report feeling more connected to others and experiencing greater levels of empathy and compassion in their daily lives.
So not only does mindfulness make us feel better, it might actually make us better people. I love that. But, thinking about all these different factors that shape our capacity for compassion, it makes you wonder if there are people who are just naturally more empathetic than others. Maybe they're wired differently or have a unique brain signature.
That's a fascinating question, and one that researchers are exploring through the study of a rare condition called synesthesia. Now, have you ever heard of synesthesia?
Synesthesia. It rings a bell, but I can't quite place it. Refresh my memory.
It's a neurological phenomenon where stimulation of one sense, like hearing, triggers an involuntary experience in another sense, like sight. For example, someone with synesthesia might see colors when they hear music or taste words when they read. It's like their senses are all blended together, creating these unique multisensory experiences.
That's wild. So it's like they're experiencing the world in a completely different way than the rest of us.
Yeah.
But what does this have to do with compassion?
Well, people with synesthesia often report experiencing heightened emotional responses, particularly to music. And research has shown that this might be related to enhanced connectivity between certain brain regions, including the auditory cortex, the insula, and the medial prefrontal cortex.
Wait a minute. Didn't we talk about those areas earlier in relation to empathy and understanding the mental states of others?
Exactly. So it's possible that this enhanced connectivity in people with synesthesia not only makes them more sensitive to the emotional power of music, but also more attuned to the feelings and experiences of others.
So they're not only experiencing the world in a more vivid way, but they're also feeling it more deeply and potentially connecting more deeply with others as a result. That's fascinating.
It really highlights the remarkable plasticity of the brain and how individual differences in neural wiring can shape our emotional experiences and our capacity for empathy.
This is all so mind-blowing. We've explored how mindfulness can train our brains for compassion, delved into the fascinating world of synesthesia, and even touched on the complex interplay of genes and experiences in shaping our levels of empathy. But before we wrap up our deep dive, I want to pose one final question to our listeners. If compassion is so deeply ingrained in our biology, does knowing that make it any less special or meaningful?
We'll be back in a moment to explore that very question and wrap up our journey into the neuroscience of compassion. Welcome back to our deep dive into the compassionate brain. We've covered a lot of ground, from the surprising role of touch to the power of mindfulness. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to the question we left you with. Does understanding the biological basis of compassion diminish its value or meaning?
It's a question that's been swirling in my mind through this entire conversation. If compassion is rooted in our genes and our neural wiring, does that make it any less special?
It's a valid question, and I think the answer lies in appreciating the incredible complexity and beauty of the human brain. Yes, we have these biological predispositions towards connection and empathy, but that doesn't mean compassion is simply a pre-programmed response, like a reflex.
So it's not just about our genes dictating our behavior. There's something more to it.
Absolutely. Our brains are constantly adapting and changing in response to our experiences, our relationships, and even our conscious choices. We have the capacity to cultivate compassion, to strengthen those neural pathways through practices like mindfulness, kindness, and forgiveness.
So even though we might have this biological foundation for compassion, it's up to us to nurture and develop it throughout our lives.
Precisely. And that's where I think the true magic lies. We're not just passive recipients of our genes. We have the power to shape our own brains and, in turn, our own capacity for compassion. And that makes every act of kindness, every gesture of empathy, all the more meaningful.
It's like we're all walking around with this incredible potential for compassion, just waiting to be unlocked. And the more we understand about the brain, the more tools we have to do just that.
Exactly. And as we continue to explore the fascinating world of the compassionate brain, I have no doubt that we'll discover even more amazing insights into the power of human connection and our capacity for good.
This has been such an incredible journey. We've learned so much about the intricate workings of the brain and how it shapes our ability to love, care, and connect with one another. It's truly inspiring.
And as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. Embrace the power of touch. Nurture your relationships. Practice mindfulness, cultivate resilience, and most importantly, never underestimate your capacity for compassion. It's within each of us to make the world a kinder, more connected, and more compassionate place.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the neuroscience of compassion. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing and those hearts open.